20 years, and I would like to invite all of you on Friday to be with us when we will have a cake to celebrate our 20th birthday as we deal with the town meeting, and also we want to join the Fort Sherman Days Committee and the Kootenai County Centennial Committee as they open their very special celebration. We're very, very lucky and very, very fortunate in Idaho College to receive the quality of speakers that we have on this forum, and they come at very little expense, and yet they're international experts. And for you who come, you are really filled with information that you will take through life. I was telling our speaker today, if you can just change a few lives in your lifetime, it is all worthwhile. I came to the podium today because I want to introduce the person hosting today's program. Each day I've asked a different individual to host, and we were appreciative for Lynn Maddie yesterday. Before introducing the person who will host today, I would like to introduce 2 or 3 people in the audience. It's such a fortunate experience to have friends in life, and one of my great friends is here today. He is a member of the board of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. He has worked in human rights for 35 years and is a prominent leader of the Hispanic community in Idaho. Let's give a North Idaho welcome to our Southern Idaho friend, Jesse Barani. Jesse, would you please stand? He also has with him today a new friend I met today, one of his staff people, Pam Wood. I would also like to introduce a member of our Board of County Commissioners who has been very instrumental in the Centennial work and the Centennial community. I did a TV show with her, and they're part of what we're doing as we kick off, or we're sharing with them on Friday, County Commissioner Ellen Adams. And now to introduce the person that will be hosting today is a very personal friend. We go back for 20 years. She is an attorney in Coeur d'Alene. She specializes in family law. And the reason I wanted to introduce her today is it was really her idea to have this subject. And we got together about 10 months ago, and through her work and the people in the Peaceful Settlements Conference, that's why we're here today. I would like to introduce the host, my friend, Sue Flanagan.
It's been a great amount of fun and pleasure for us as we have talked together about a program. We had the feeling that as we examined our community and our county, as well as I was looking at this from my work in the family law area, that we certainly have to acknowledge that a major issue all of us face is conflict. And what happens to us is a direct result in how we handle the conflict. Conflict is a fact of life. But we can choose constructive ways of handling conflict, or we can handle conflict in extremely negative ways that have tremendous cost to all of us. So as we were talking about the program, we wanted to be sure to have part of the activities of the week focused on the family. And I knew that Dr. John Haynes was going to be at Peaceful Settlements in Boise, which is starting tomorrow and will conclude on Friday. So as I had taken John Haynes' training in Seattle several years ago. It's a 5-day training course in mediation. So we've had the pleasure of becoming friends over the years, and we have worked together on other efforts regarding the establishment of the mediation process in the family law area in the state of Idaho. So it was with such pleasure and excitement I was able to call Tony Stewart back to say, Dr. Haynes indicated that he would be very pleased to come to Coeur d'Alene. I wanted to share with you some information about Dr. Haynes. First of all, he is the person who has given theory to the process of mediation. He is the leading expert on theories of mediation, development of mediation in the United States. He will be modest and say, well, that isn't quite right, but we know that it is true. It's different from arbitration, and that's why I make a big to-do about the term mediation. And we have another whole process for dispute resolution, wherein the person conducting the process has actual authority to make the decision. And mediation is quite a different process. You have a mediator, but that mediator doesn't have that decision-making authority. And it was Dr. John Haynes who established this kind of a process, articulated the process, and that's why it's such an exciting thing that he's here today to share this kind of information with you. He has trained over 4,000 mediators in the world, not only the United States and Canada, England, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. He has also worked with judges in judicial systems through many states of the United States, including Idaho, I want you to know. He is the president of the Haynes Mediation Associates and the Mediation Training Institute, a national mediation training program for attorneys and mental health professionals. He is also the founding president of the Academy of Family Mediators, which is a national organization of practicing mediators. He began his work in mediation when he was a tenured associate professor in the School of Social Welfare at SUNY Stony Brook Health Science Center from 1972 to 1985. He also has done other speech writing and so on. He has just recently had a book published, and he and his wife Gretchen are the authors. The book is called Mediating Divorce, a Casebook of Strategies for Successful Family Negotiations. It is with a great deal of pleasure and a very distinct privilege for me to have the Dr. John Haynes come and address us today. Dr. Haynes.
Thank you, Sue. I want to talk a little bit today about the family. First, from a policy perspective, what's happening, and then focus down into the individual family and suggest some things that you and I can do in our own families to attempt to restore the family as the central part of our society. Because I believe that essentially we have given up on the family. We have given up on the family. And we can see that in numerous ways. The report yesterday from the Center on Children in Poverty that indicates that now 1 in 4 children under the age of 6 live in poverty. Almost 25%, it's actually 23% of all children under the age of 6 in the United States live in poverty. There are 100,000 crack babies born every year in the United States, and that number is increasing dramatically. Last year, 40,000 children, infants, died from lack of medical care in the United States. And one has to assume, and when you add to that, by the way, the fact that the majority of homeless in this country are children under the age of 10. The majority of the homeless are children under 10. There's 5 million live in poverty, right? 5 million live in poverty. The majority of the homeless are children under the age of 10. And then when we look at my work, which involves working with families that are more affluent than the numbers I have just given to you, we see that every year, in the last few years, there have been approximately 2.4 marriages and 1.2 million divorces. And so that every year, half, essentially, equivalent of half of the number of those who marry or so divorce. And part of it, I sense, is that we have adopted with great enthusiasm the concept of the disposable society, so that we can dispose of a quarter of our children into poverty, just as easily as we can dispose of our marriage if it doesn't work. And so that what we find, I think, is that the family, which historically, at least for the last 200 years, has been central to our society, is beginning to crumble. It's beginning to crumble partly because of our mobility. I'm a good example of that. My parents live in England. My wife and I live in New York. And our two married daughters live in San Antonio, Texas. So that there's no nuclear family or extended family in our situation. There were never, as our children were growing up, the kind of extended family resources to support them. And then there's another factor to come back to the social policy issue. What we discover when we look at the data is that since 1977, between 77 and 88, essentially the decade, the lowest 20% income groups in the United States, we divide all people into groups of 20% according to income, the lowest 20%, suffered a decline of 11.8% in real income over that decade, whilst their tax bite rose 2.6%. Their real spending power dropped almost 12%. Their taxes went up 2.6%. They obviously were not reading somebody's lips. The upper 20%, by the way, enjoyed a 30% increase in real income over that same decade. And lo and behold, paid 46% less taxes. If you take the top 1% of our society, over that decade, they enjoyed an 85% increase in real income and a 23% decline in their tax bind. If you look at the middle groups have held their ground, but primarily because of another social event, which is over the last 15 years or so, there's been the massive re-entry of women into the workplace. So that now almost 70% of all women with mothers with children now work also outside the home. They're the double job holders, working inside the home and outside the home. And it's the fact of that double income that has in fact maintained their relative position, has not resulted in a significant increase in their standard of living, in the standard of living of most working and middle class families over the last decade. And yet we see that here we have 70% of women with children working outside the home because they have to, economically. Many do also because they want to, because it is more rewarding, psychologically and intellectually. But most do it because they have to economically. And what that means, then, one would assume that if we cared about families, we would now have the kind of child care facilities that almost every other industrial country enjoys and provides for families to support them. But we don't. We don't. So that we don't have the facilities to support families, and yet we talk as if we have great values about the family as being central to our society. But none of our actions, in fact, demonstrate that. And what I see as a mediator who works with families is that the major product, I believe, of divorce is from two primary sources. And one of those is the number of divorces that take place 1 to 2 years after the wife re-enters the workforce. That is that when she re-enters the workforce, there is no negotiations that take place within the family to reassign the workload in the house. And that in and of itself causes enormous conflict, which I find frequently concludes in a divorce. The second major cause will then lead me to shift from the policy to the individual question, is that it is my belief that the primary task of every new marriage, of every couple in the new marriage, to negotiate the sensitive question of which family of origin will survive in that family. Is it going to be mine, or is it going to be my wife's? I was lucky in one sense that I had such a great admiration for my wife's family that I wanted much more to emulate them in my adulthood than in my own family. But I remember in the early stages of our marriage getting into some very difficult situations. For example, my mother, who thought that I shared certain characteristics with Jesus, cleaned my shoes every day until I married him. And I remember her cleaning them for me on my marriage day. I left England a week later. So that she cleaned them every day, right up until I was 25, 26, when I got married. So I had no idea that one's mother or spouse didn't clean one's shoes. And after about 2 weeks here in the United States, my shoes were getting quite grubby. And I gently drew the attention of Gretchen to the fact that my shoes were dirty. She equally gently pointed out to me where the shoe cleaning products were in the apartment. We both did it very gently because we both grew up in families in which no conflict was permitted. Nobody ever raised a voice in my family. I have a suspicion if I had gone home one afternoon and said to my mother, "Mother, I have just robbed a bank, raped 3 women, and I have knocked down an old lady at a crossing," she would have said, "Oh dear, do have a cup of tea." It would have been just more than she could have bear. And Gretchen's family is very much the same. Neither of her parents ever raised their voices. And so, in one sense, I've had to learn how to negotiate. I had to learn how to deal with conflict productively. And I'm going to share them with you. Some of my thoughts about productive negotiations in marriages. Because my sense is that marriage is a great opportunity to blend the two families of origin into something unique for each of us. And that when we achieve it, it is a great blessing and something that draws us closer together, gives us a meaningful relationship that can weather most storms. And our failure to do that is I think, one of the primary causes of divorce. And so, let me look at a couple of thoughts. Let me give you one more thought in terms of social policy. Part of the problem, I think, as I look at the legislation that has been enacted over the years, is that too often legislation winds up to be anti-family, even though we've not particularly thought about it. And that I think that one of the things that we might be talking about, and we might want to talk about this in the American government class, is ought there to be a family impact study conducted on all legislation in the same way that we do frequently environmental impact studies on various pieces of projects and legislation. And I'll give you a quick example of why I think this is important. Last week, I live on Long Island, pronounced Long Island, and the county there announced a plan to develop child care facilities for county workers, and we all applauded. And I looked at how they're going to do this. They're going to do this by allowing all county workers to deduct from their salary up to $3,000 a year in order to pay for child care, so that they then will be able to have child care services on site, quality child care, and that will come out of their paycheck. Now, the reason the county would do that is that, you see, the county would not pay its 7.5% or 8% Social Security on that $3,000 because that's money that comes off the top. It's tax-free, both for Social Security taxes as well as for income taxes. So when you stop and think about that now, what we're saying to those families is, don't put money away for your future Social Security. Save the government that money so we can spend it on child care. And don't worry about the consequences come the year 2020 when you're getting ready to retire. And we've, of course, chipped away significantly at the contributions for your Social Security. So that what looks like a great idea has long-term consequences to the family, particularly as we all age. I mean, I'm very interested in this issue of aging parents, having gone through a very difficult situation with Gretchen's mother, and concerned now increasingly about my own advancing age and what liabilities I will be to my children. And it just seems to me that to enact ideas and policies that doesn't look at the long-term implications and what it means to the family is, I think, going to be dangerous. And so I would suggest that one of the things is to look to see what would be the implications if, in fact, for each of the tax cuts before they did it, somebody had to explain exactly what that would mean to family life. Somebody had said to us 10 years ago that it would mean pushing another 3 or 4 million children into poverty, would mean some of the consequences out there that we have seen. Would we have rushed into it so quickly? Maybe we would, maybe not. But at least we would have done it knowingly. And then we could not claim to be such a great family people that we are. Let me then turn with that comment to some thoughts about conflict on an interpersonal basis. Conflict in and of itself is very healthy because it can force you to think through different ideas and different ways of dealing with problems and can produce productive results. Unresolved conflict, however, is very unhealthy and very, very dangerous. There is a cycle of conflict that develops that has been clearly identified and which enables each of us to determine how we play out conflict situations. In a study, for example, of college roommates in 1981, it was discovered that students who tended to blame their roommate for conflict reported that the two of them had more conflicts than did those who tended to blame themselves. So that blaming the other person for the conflict, there tends to be a correlation between that act and the amount of the conflict. And students who blame their roommates for conflict also employed more win-lose strategies in their conflict and fewer problem-solving or win-win strategies in dealing with their conflicts. If you compare that to a married couple study that was done in 1984, it indicated that husbands and wives who made more use of the win-lose tactics, tactics such as threats, positional commitments, and put-downs, reported that they experienced more conflict and tended to blame the partner more in comparison to the self for the conflicts they experienced. So that since conflict is inevitable, part of the problem in dealing with conflict and with its spiraling upward is, in fact, the willingness of the participants of the conflict to take some personal responsibility for it, rather than to blame the other. So that, in a sense, you could say that the more conflicts there are in a relationship, and the more intense those conflicts are, the more blame will be assigned to the partner, and the less blame will be assigned to oneself. The corollary of that is that the more the blame is assigned to the partner, and the less to oneself, the more likely one is to use win-lose tactics and to avoid problem-solving tactics. Because if I can be convinced that all of our problems lie in Gretchen's refusal to be reasonable, I can therefore demand of her the change. And one of the fascinating things I see in all of the divorce cases that I come in is that the first things that people tell me in the family problem, each member has a definition of that problem that is different from the others. And each definition, problem, can only be solved by a change in the behavior of the other. We see this all the time in family therapy, see it all the time in family mediation. When they come in, his definition of the problem is such that it can only be resolved if she changes. Her definition of the problem, it can only be resolved if he changes. Where we demand that the other one changes, then obviously we have no commitment to finding a solution because we disclaim responsibility for the conflict and therefore for the solution of the conflict. The third part that comes from this is that when win-lose tactics are employed and problem-solving tactics are avoided, that the conflicts proliferate and become more and more intense. And so that there is a cycle that, at least on one level, can only be broken when the participants to the conflict can each share the responsibility for that conflict. Now, when you start to think about it, it makes a great deal of sense because it fits in with all of the other codependency literature that we know. That to do something destructive, you have to have codependence to help you do that. Codependency exists in all bad relationships, in all difficult family situations. There's a codependency where the family supports the alcoholism, for example. And it's not until they break that dependency that the alcoholic seeks help towards the road towards recovery. And we can see that in all kinds of spheres. And it would seem to me that in conflict also then, there is a codependency. Because as long as we don't accept responsibility, push it always on the other person, then it will always proliferate. If it doesn't, if we accept the responsibility for our part of the conflict, then that's the first step in which we can break it. One of the tragedies on the national scene in the last few years has been the use of the blaming spiral in political advertising. That the negative advertising in the last few national campaigns, and you've seen some of it in your state campaigns and in my state campaigns, where each of the ads tries to blame the other more. And so there's a spiral of blame goes up. And ultimately, of course, then nobody is responsible for finding solutions to the problem. And that they engender, in fact, what so many of us experience in our personal lives, which is that spiral of blame which we don't take responsibility for. And if we see our national leaders not taking responsibility for it either, it in a sense reinforces our belief that that's the appropriate way to behave. And so that in some ways, we have to, I think, break the cycle of blame in conflict that we ourselves use in order to be able to create change on a national level, to be able to ask from our leaders a more responsible way of conducting themselves and a more responsible way for conducting the national dialogue on important political issues. The future of the country does not rest on whether or not Willie Horton was released. It rests on much more fundamental and basic issues. But you see, if you can just keep blaming the other guy, particularly if it's something that nobody has no meaning on a national presidential level, then you simply develop that cycle and you can win, because most people engage in that cycle of blame in their conflict in their own lives. And so we ourselves then want to change that, because what happens psychologically as the conflict generates is that there are psychological changes, the development of anger, right? The negative attitudes and the negative images that we develop of our adversary, the hostile goals that we develop and hold, the distrust, the lack of empathy, and the reduced willingness to communicate with the other person. And how many people in this room have not experienced a day or so in where you just haven't spoken to your significant other because the anger is there, the conflict is there, the blame is there, but the willingness to take some responsibility for the blame is not there. And it's that lack of responsibility then that helps to ferment that silent anger that goes on in so many of our families. So let me then turn to about 12 guidelines for decision making and suggestions for constructive conflict, and share these with you. The first, it seems to me, in any conflict situation is to be specific when you introduce the problem. To be very specific about what it is that is wrong. We all have so many oblique ways of saying things that it's very hard sometimes for the other one to know exactly what it is that we're saying. So that sometimes Gretchen and I get into these crazy discussions about whether we should see movie A or movie B. Both of us trying to dance around the fact that we don't want to see the other's choice. But therefore don't want to push our own choice. And neither of us are really clear. I can't tell you how many evenings we've stayed home so that we could both disenjoy it, rather than communicate and say, I would like to see the good movie. So be specific when you introduce the problem. That's the first one. The second is that, the second part of that, be specific, is that one has to be able to state the problem clearly and unambiguously, but also one has to be able to avoid ordering or directing or commanding a change, telling somebody to do something, giving them an order. We had been married about a month, and I ran my finger across the top of the refrigerator in a New York City apartment. And that black grit that accumulates there. Immediately I thought, my God, if my mother comes to visit, I'm done. From 3,000 miles, she could still control me, you see. And immediately I said, that's outrageous. This top is dirty. Clean it. The fear of my mother was greater than the fear of Gretchen at that stage. So I was able to stay it, but I commanded it. She sort of did it halfway, and then turned to me and said in tears, what time do you go to work this morning? And I said, well, I left the same time as you did, 8 o'clock. And she said, what time do you get home tonight? Well, I said, I got home about 10 minutes before you did at 6 o'clock. And she said, well, why do you think I have more opportunity to clean it than you do? And I remember feeling devastated at the time, because my concern, of course, had nothing to do with the fact that she had failed to wash the top of the refrigerator. But my concern was, what would my mother say in the unlikely event she ever flew 3,000 miles to visit with us in that situation? So that be clear and specific about the problem. If I had said to her at that stage, of course I would have been much wiser much earlier, But if I had said to her at that stage, darling, the top of the refrigerator is grungy, we have to do something about it because, that gets to me, things would have been quite different. So don't just complain. So no matter how specifically you complain, you not only have to state the problem, but you must ask for a reasonable change that will relieve the problem. And you have to ask that of yourself as well as the person with whom you're having a conflict. Because ultimately in life, the only thing you can control is your behavior. You can influence others' behavior, but you can't control their behavior. You can control your own. And so I always ask myself now, first, what shift I can make to solve the problem. And then in the same token, then say, I'm willing to do this. I would like you to do your piece, which is this, in order to solve this problem. So that, don't complain. State specifically what the problem is, and then state specifically a reasonable change that you can ask for that will relieve the problem. And you can think about that in campus dorm, in terms of what you do with people who are up later than everybody else, or make noise, or leave the bathroom dirty, or whatever it is. There's no benefit from simply harboring the anger towards that person, particularly that person as your roommate. There is a great benefit to be had from being able to specifically state the problem and the reasonable solution to that problem. As the discussion develops, ask for and give feedback on the major points. Now, this is a little hard because feedback is sometimes misunderstood. If Gretchen is apoplectic about something and I say to her, and she tells me something, and I say to her, you seem angry, my dear. That is feedback, but of the inappropriate kind. She knows she's angry, and she doesn't need me to tell her. She is indeed telling me that she is angry, and she doesn't need my validation of her anger. What she needs is my validation of her concern. And so that instead of feeding back saying, you sound angry, my sweet, one has to say, okay, if I understand now what you're saying is that you would prefer it if I got up on Saturday mornings a little earlier. That was another one of our early conflicts. My mother always let me sleep until noon. And brought me tea up into bed just to make sure I was comfortable. It took me a long time to recognize the benefits that I gained. I could see very clearly the benefits I had lost. So give feedback in terms that you understand what it is that the other person is saying to you. And ask them to give you feedback. This is hard, because if you say, do you understand what I'm saying? You can say that in two ways. You can say, you've said what you said, do you understand what I'm trying to say? Which is an appeal. Or you can say, do you understand what I'm saying? Which is more of an imperative. I have discovered in good relationships that imperatives have no place in good relationships. So, assure yourself that you understand what the other person wants. I got that from my early days as a labor management negotiator. I was trained by a superb negotiator who said to me the first time I went into some serious negotiations. At that stage I was representing the unions, not representing the unions and sometimes the companies at other times. And he said to me, now listen, what you got to do is just listen hard while we're in there. Because I want you, when you come out, to tell me exactly what it is that they want. And then we'll figure out how to get it to them in the context that we get what we want. I said, gee, that's not negotiating, Henry. You're supposed to lay out just a little bit, see how they nibble, see how you can push them towards their bottom line. He said, nonsense. He said, don't worry about what they get. Worry about what you get. And if you get what we need for our membership, they can have the rest. And good luck. And that to me was a great lesson, because he taught me that systematically over the years, and I myself became a pretty good negotiator, listening to what the other side wanted, to the best of my ability, delivering that whilst making sure I got what I needed for my constituency. And in the same sense, you see, if you're assuring yourself that you understand what the other one wants, then you can begin to figure out how to get it to them in the context of getting what you want out of that conflict also. So that the worst posture of all is the posture of defense. As soon as somebody criticizes us, our immediate and automatic reaction is to feel defensive, no matter how true it is. And that we do all kinds of things to prevent being responsible when we're criticized. But that in fact, we can be non-defensive and say, okay, what can I take out of what this person is saying to me to find acceptable? See if I can do that, and see if I can get what I want in my sense. I can improve the relationship in that way. Make sure you confine the discussion to a single issue. One of the great problems of all negotiating and all conflict is the proliferation of issues, so that you don't know which ball you have up in the air at any given moment, and you're not clear about which is the significant one. And people often throw in, they read these books by Carras and some of these other negotiating experts, you see, throw in all these red herrings so that you can sort of steer your course through all the red herrings. I don't think that helps one iota. It certainly doesn't help in interpersonal relationships. It doesn't seem to me to help very much in negotiating relationships. So stick to one issue, otherwise you'll find that it's possible for the other person in the conflict to evade the issue that you really want. If they raise a secondary issue, say, okay, let us deal with that as soon as we've dealt with this one. Give them the respect for their issue and guarantee the opportunity to deal with that. So if you're complaining about have loud noise on their rock and roll thing late at night, and they have a complaint that you wake them up early in the morning, which is usually the opposite of the problem, that you can't say that's not an issue. Acknowledge the issue. Say, okay, let's deal with the late night noise first, my problem, then I guarantee we'll deal with the early morning, your problem, and we'll see what we can come up with a solution. Don't deal with both problems at the same time. Don't be glib or intolerant. Don't give solutions and suggestions to people for their problems. Don't tell them how to solve the problem. Give them advice. You'll find in most interpersonal relationships that are meaningful, the opportunity to disclose yourself and your fears to your significant other is probably one of the most important aspects of that relationship. And so, when I go home and I want to unload about a concern that I have, I haven't done many intakes this week. One problem with me in private practice is you're always concerned about the flow of clients. And Gretchen used to say to me, oh, don't worry about it, you're good, it'll come about. And the more she would tell me not to worry, then I would get angry. And then before I knew what it was, we were having an argument about it. And that wasn't the issue. I didn't need her to tell me not to worry. All I needed to tell me was to listen to me while I unloaded. And so that very often conflicts come about because we try to solve problems that really don't exist. You can't solve my fears. You can't solve certain things that your significant other comes up with, but you can listen, and in the process of listening, relieve them. And if you are listened to, you are relieved. So that in the conflict situation, don't immediately give advice on how to do that. Seek the answer that the person with the problem wants, and then figure out how to make that happen before then. Don't tell them what they need. Nothing is more frustrating in an argument, in a conflict, than to somebody come up with an immediate solution. Because 9 times out of 10, your solution misses the point, number one. Secondly, your solution will generally benefit you more than it will benefit them. And that, therefore, will only escalate the blaming cycle and the cycle of conflict. Remember the only piece of absolute importance that I will say this morning, which is that there is no truth anywhere. There are only perceptions. And that your perception is as good and as valid as my perception. There is no truth. The search for truth is like the search for the Holy Grail, littered with dead bodies. The perceptions that you have are as valid as the perceptions that I have in the relationship. Truth is totally irrelevant. And therefore, don't search for the truth. Search for the solution. The truth, you see, that you search for is your definition of the problem. Perception, if you're looking for the perception, then you're looking for what your perception is and seeing the way in which your significant other's perception differs. And they're both valid at all times. And I can tell you that from my professional experience, that I have never heard truth in a room. I've always heard at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 perceptions, all of which have some validity, and all of which have some overlap. And then my task as a mediator is to find those overlapping perceptions, which in a sense is the overlapping self-interest of the people in dispute. So that discard the search for truth. Don't allow counter-demands. Don't allow trades. Deal with those separately. I said to you before, don't take extra ones. Also, don't allow counter-demands. Well, I'll do that if you do so-and-so. Because you ought to solve the problems one at a time and not log-roll. Those of you who are privileged to be my age and have raised children through the teenage eras, or are they eras? You know that your children log-roll you on every negotiation. That is, whatever you lay down, they have a counter-demand in the negotiations. And that's perfectly okay. But it's not okay to take your issues and trade them for their issues. It is to be respectful of their issues insofar as you can be, and to require respect for your issues insofar as that is reasonable. And so, don't counter-demand. Never assume that you know what the other negotiator is thinking. Assumption is the most difficult and dangerous position. There's a recent conflict that I saw in which a neighbor was mowing his lawn and the lawnmower broke. And he fiddled about with the lawn. He was halfway through the lawn and he was mumbling to himself. And he said, I'm going to have to go over to Smith and see if I can borrow his lawnmower. He's got that nice lawnmower. He's going to laugh at me. He's going to snicker. He's going to say, see, I got the good lawnmower. I got the deer. Why did you buy that Sears thing? And he's going to want me to bring it back clean, and then he's going to, be smug about it. And as we're talking to himself about all these things, and he finally gets to Smith's door, he said, I bet you he's going to say to me, he can't, because he's going to want to use it himself. He rings the doorbell. He said, this guy always is one up on me. And Smith opens the door. My neighbor says, you know what you can do with your lawnmower? You see an enormous amount we project our own feelings, our own fears, our own behaviors on other people. And we don't have to do that because they've got enough crazy behaviors and feelings of their own without taking on the burden of our distortions. So that if we don't assume what it is that the other negotiator is thinking until you've checked it out in plain language, you can say, is it what you're saying to me is, and then one repeats what you believe to be the essence of the position of the other side, rather than assuming that they are doing anything. I never crystal ball glaze whilst I'm working with other people. I'm guided by a much more important imperative, which is the belief that there is that of God in each of us, and that my task in life is to find him in all whom I meet. As George Fox said, to go cheerfully into the world, seeking that of God in all you meet. And that if I remember that in my middle of my conflict, I can remember to look for the good. You can spell God with 1 or 2 O's. Looking for the good in the other person than the evil. And once you begin with that, you change a whole lot of assumptions about the other person. And you're working on them to find the goodness in them rather than the badness in them. Don't correct the other person's statement of their feelings, Don't use humor to play a game or to use sarcasm. Because if you try to interpret what their feelings are, you'll most likely will be incorrect. And that will only escalate their feeling and their sense of bad resolution. Don't withdraw, don't distract, don't humor people, don't divert them. Gretchen comes down the stairs angry and says, "Why can't you put your dirty shirts in the laundry bag?" And I say, "Because I love you, sweetheart." I know that will push the button to escalate the conflict. I've now learned that I put them in the basket. I have to because I now do the washing. I think it's a very important thing that people should put their stuff in the basket when they're doing the washing. It's a very fundamental piece of housekeeping. The other part about all conflict is to remember that you must focus on the future, not the past. You cannot change the past. Whatever I did yesterday is done and unchangeable and stands in history immutable. I can regret it, I can rejoice about it, I cannot change it. I can, however, shape the future. And so that in conflict, the more that I am future-focused, in terms of what do we do in the future, rather than what did I do in the past. I can't not pick up that shirt. I can, in the future, not drop my shirt on the floor. So that if we focus on the future, you're going to find 2 interesting things happen. The first is that there is hope in the future. There is no hope in the conflict from yesterday or this morning. There is hope in the future, in the relationship, number 1. Number 2 is that it is impossible to complain about the future. Now don't misuse this because but I find in an argument with people that if I keep talking about well, tell me what you do want. Tell me what you do want to do. You can't complain about tomorrow. You can't complain that I'm not going to pick up my shirt tomorrow. Complain about what I did this morning. We can talk about how I will not do it tomorrow. You can't really complain about it because it hasn't yet happened. And so the more that you can shift the conflict from a rehashing of the past to a reshaping of the future, the more opportunities there are to discover ways of solving it and to stop the complaint about it when the other person is involved. And lastly, I think, let me say this. We must all abandon the idea that there is one perfect solution. I suppose, one of the problems of growing up on television is that you think that everything can be settled in 1/2 hour. The problem is presented, defined, understood, and solved, all in 30 minutes with a 5-minute outtake for the advertising. So in 25 minutes, you can solve it. And there always is the perfect solution. I hated when my children were growing up. They loved Little House on the Prairie. And I hated it because they were such a perfect family, and they always made me feel so inadequate because they always had the perfect solution. But in life, there are no perfect solutions. And so that the other is to remember that you must give up the idea of finding one perfect solution. So I think that we can help people in ourselves break the blame spiral by focusing on good conflict management, being able to respect the other person, and following some of the guidelines that I have suggested today. Because if we can do that individually in our own lives, we can then transform those around us, those with whom we come into contact. And as we transform them, then we transform society as a whole. And so that it all depends, ultimately, on what you do and what I do. And it all depends on the willingness and the ability for you to take responsibility for your peace and for me to take responsibility for my peace. And together, we can then have a much more responsible society. Thank you. Where do we go? Okay. Tony tells me we can deal with some questions if you have questions. No free consultations, but we will deal with questions. Cooperative. Couldn't have been that good. Yes, sir.
I found that the biggest problem is dealing with the unconscious aspect of each person. They're not really aware. They lack awareness.
Yeah. Well, I would never confront anybody when they're unconscious. You see? Because, in a sense, you're playing with their minds if you suggest that there is a second or third level on which they're behaving. I am capable of looking sometimes at my second level. And when I understand that, I can then shift my own behavior. But I would personally never worry about the motivations of the other person, because I would believe that at some level they do not want this conflict, they want to end the conflict, and I would then work with them to achieve that goal, regardless of what their motivation was. Yes, sir?
Is it possible that there are those among us who do indeed feed on conflict and that they find in that a kind of an energy for living?
Well, there are what we call conflict junkies. In family therapy, you see quite a lot of them. I think it is not so much that they feed on it, although some people feed on the excitement that the conflict generates, but more that has become the method of relating, and it's the only way they now know. You see some couples that relate only through continual bickering. I mean, I'm sure that you've all got people that you invite to social gatherings that you have second thoughts about each time because they bicker so much. And they're caught up in that. That's the only way they know. And I would suspect that they don't really like that. They would prefer a different way of relating, but they don't know how, they are good candidates for some family therapy, in a sense, but they're also usually the last people to believe that they have a problem. I'd say this is why I also believe, that we should all have an annual well family checkup from a psychological perspective as well as a physical perspective, you see. Because then we could pick some of these things up as they're developing as we go through. But that's an enormous admission to do.
Some of this process requires some forethought. How do you deal with their spontaneous kinds of outbursts of anger and things that come up in their spontaneous manner?
Very gingerly. Very gingerly. What I try to do is, the first thing I do is to get centered, because immediately somebody explodes on me, I'm back off and I'm a jelly wobbling on the plate here. So I've got to first of all get myself back into some shape and center. It's not me that this person is trying to destroy. And then when I do that, I either take a deep breath or whatever, then try to go to find what it is that is the cause of the anger and get a clear statement of the problem. And it doesn't always work. But that's, spontaneously, the thing I think to remember in any spontaneous conflict is to first center yourself. That goes from when somebody pushes you in front of you in the line at the checkout in the supermarket, right? I usually find it takes me longer to center myself than that does for them to get through the checkout. That's a good way of resolving that conflict. But sometimes I'm able to say, excuse me, sir, excuse me, ma'am, there's a line here. I don't think you saw it. Let's give the person an ad if that's possible. And so they would do that. Jostling, people jostle me in queues is the thing I find most aggravating. And it's spontaneous. But that first I make sure that I'm as centered as I can reasonably be at that moment, that I don't act out of this sense of highly defensive posture, which is always an offensive act. When you are in a defensive position, your reaction is offensive. And therefore I always try not to be in a defensive position, so therefore I'm not offensive, if I can possibly be. Yes, ma'am?
If you end up going into a negotiation situation where you as an individual feel that it's a win-win negotiation strategy, and find out you're in a win-lose situation where everything is free, whether whatever they choose to do to win, they don't care. Can you tell me how to turn that around? What suggestions would?
I don't believe there is such a thing as what we call a zero-sum game, which is that if you win, I must lose. And so that in a situation where I think one finds this a lot in legal negotiations, where one side comes on blustering and tough and they ain't gonna give an inch, right? That obviously, at some point, that party wants to settle. Their expectations may, in the early stages, be unreasonable. So that part of the process of negotiations is to lower the other side's expectations. And one does that in two ways. You do that in principal negotiations by being very clear about the general area in which you're willing to settle. So that it is clear to them, if they've come with unreasonably high expectations, that your expectations are within an arena that they ain't going to meet. They then have to choose whether to adjust or hold on and choose an alternative arena. Remember that most people ultimately don't want to go to the alternative arena because it's more expensive. So that first one has to be clear to the other side as to exactly what it is that you want out of the negotiations, so as to clearly identify your aspiration. Their aspiration or expectation then can be modified based on the new information that they get from you. That's the first step. It is not good to be soft on that issue. You have to be quite clear and firm and precise about what your aspiration is in those negotiations. The second, then, is to begin to look at their demands. Which parts of their demands can you meet? And you can then make a decision to move in one or two directions. You can say, okay, I'm now going to unilaterally make a series of small concessions. And I'm going, in my mind, to do these, regardless of the response of the other side, up to 3 concessions. Small, that don't endanger my aspiration, but are concessions to that person's expectation, their aspiration. With the expectation that they, in fact, will reciprocate. And in normative, all of the studies that have been done, and in all of the most experiences, the concept of reciprocity overpowers the hard line. That is, if you make 3 concessions, in a sense, you may not get a response on the first 2, but you certainly get a response on the third. So then, that then is to begin what we call reciprocal bargaining, or tit-for-tat bargaining, which is you make a small concession and ask them to make a small concession. That's another way to get something moving. And ultimately, however, in all negotiations, I think that you have to set your own bottom line, that is the point at which you feel you would be better off somewhere else in some different arena than in the one you're currently in. So that you're clear in your head that you don't give away simply because the other side is overly tough. Because that's really what it's all about. They bluster and they come on looking big and tough because they really want to intimidate you. And you have to make a decision that you're not going to be intimidated. And the best way to do that is to be very clear that you're not going to settle anywhere close to your bottom line. And to communicate that very clearly to the other side. While always being principled. You see, the other side will overstate their case, they will exaggerate the data, they will lie to you. You, however, must always be principled, not exaggerate your case, lay out your case firmly and clearly, make it very precise that you ain't giving in below your reasonable expectations. Obviously, there's some give and take that goes on in the negotiations where you each change your beginning aspirations to accommodate the reality that you discover in the discussions. But that if you're clear about that, and you don't get intimidated by that person's blustering or apparent toughness, because it's usually often a cover for total weakness, then you can go through knowing A, that you did your best effort to sell, and B, that you didn't sell yourself out. Because you always took it to some other way of dealing with it. And my sense is that in most negotiations, most people want to settle it. They do not want to continue. They in fact come to you, you come to negotiate at a time when you both feel the conflict has run on too long. That's when you actually ultimately sit down to talk about it. So there is a willingness, the acknowledgement of sitting down to talk about it is an indication that both sides have become exhausted with the conflict and want some solution.
Dr. Haynes, you talked last night, I think it'd be helpful to the audience to talk about metaphors and how we would create this consistent metaphors that increases confidence in society.
Okay. This is one of the chapters in my next book. But if you think about how we think collectively about conflict, conflict, of course, is an idea. Ideas can only be conveyed by using metaphors. I can only convey an idea to you by using a metaphor that has a physical quality. That is, for example, you could say to me, golly, John, your speech today was shallow. Now, you can't, into my ideas, put your finger like a puddle and measure how shallow the ideas were. Right? the ideas don't have a physical quality, but the only way we have communicating is through physical terms. One of the main metaphors that we use in terms of argument is that argument or conflict is war. So that the kind of metaphors we use in about argument and about war is, she marshaled her facts. You know, he demolished the other side. All of those kinds of metaphors that we use are almost always, if you read most of the literature about conflict, and if you listen to people, and it intrigues me in this last year as I've been thinking and listening to this, how many peace-loving people use the war metaphor in their everyday conversation. What I have discovered as a mediator is that it is much more useful for the mediator to consciously use the metaphor, conflict is a journey. So that we begin by getting the data so we can start from some solid ground, try to see where we're going with this one, we're trying to cross this hurdle, or we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. That the argument, the conflict then becomes a journey that must be undertaken in order to reach the solution. And I'm finding it very interesting, these different metaphors. I had a client the other week who said to his wife at one point, look, don't start now, because, you know, I'm going to walk out of here, you're going to walk out of here, we're both going to go to lawyers. My lawyer's going to rattle my cage. I said to myself, a fascinating metaphor. What does that mean? It means I'm a gorilla, an animal, to be caged, that can be rattled. And of course, you see, we begin to believe our metaphors and act on our metaphors. And so I said to him, you know, one of the things you want to do then is to sort of rein yourself in a bit, keeping the same metaphor, right? So that we can then complete this race, or this journey, in a better control. I try to switch the metaphor that the client is using into a non-war, non-animalistic, into a journey metaphor. So that, in a sense, to convey all of the ideas about what it is that we're doing in productive terms rather than in destructive terms. It takes enormous, enormous effort. I mean, I've been doing it for a year. I probably only pick up one or two metaphors in a session of an hour because it's all so natural to us to describe those. I mean, I just said you pick up one or two metaphors. You can't pick up a metaphor. It's not an object. Right? So anyway, that's part of my thinking about life in general. So as you talk yourself in the next week or two and you listen to your friends talk, see what metaphors you use, see what metaphors they use, and see how appropriate they are for the image you have for yourself.
We're going to have to close because he has to go to a TV show, but this afternoon there'll be a panel at 1:30. He will be there. Dr. Haynes was apparently had a great time yesterday afternoon. A lot of lively dialogue. We hope you'll be with us. And Dr. Haynes, thank you for being here today. You've been most